Queen Anne Boleyn, second wife of King Henry VIII, suffered a miscarriage on the 29th of January 1536. Less than 4 months later, Anne was executed on what most historians believe to be false charges of high treason, and Henry VIII moved on to wife number 3. But what if Anne Boleyn hadn't miscarried? What would have happened? That's what I'm going to explore today, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, as I'm sure there'll be some factors that I'll forget. But first, let's look at the background to this marriage and what happened. Henry VIII had married Catherine of Aragon in 1509, and their marriage seemed a happy and loving one for many years. But by the mid-1520s, Henry had become convinced that there was something wrong. Catherine had experienced at least 6 pregnancies, but sadly the majority had ended in stillbirths. A son had been born early in the marriage, but he died when he was less than 2 months old, and only a daughter, Mary, had survived. A daughter was only good for diplomacy, for marrying off to a foreign power. She couldn't inherit the throne, and Henry VIII needed to secure the Tudor line. Henry had an illegitimate son, so he knew the problem wasn't him, or so he thought. So, therefore, the marriage must be wrong. He'd married his brother's widow, an impure act according to the Old Testament book of Leviticus, so God wasn't blessing the marriage. When he became attracted to one of his wife's ladies, Anne Boleyn, and she refused to be his mistress, Henry decided to get his marriage to Catherine annulled. After all, it must be invalid as it was against biblical law, and marry Anne Boleyn. God would surely bless that marriage. I'm not going to go into details about the great matter, but getting his first marriage annulled wasn't plain sailing, and Henry ended up breaking with Rome and making himself head of the church in England so that he could get his church to annul the marriage. But that wasted about 6 years. 6 years of Anne's fertility. Still, Anne became pregnant straight after the private ceremony that I believe they had in November 1532, and a healthy baby girl was born in September 1533, the future Elizabeth I. Henry and Anne were disappointed that Anne hadn't given birth to the expected prince, but the success of this pregnancy showed that Anne was fertile and could carry a baby to term. There was hope for the future. Unfortunately, a second pregnancy in 1534 must have ended in a stillbirth or was a false pregnancy. But Anne became pregnant again in the autumn of 1535, following the successful royal progress to the southwest. Surely this time the baby would be a boy. On the 7th of January 1536, Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, died. She'd been banished from court and separated from their daughter Mary for some years, but she'd still managed to be a thorn in the king's side, with her refusal to accept her demotion from Queen to Princess Dowager of Wales, and the way that Catholics at court still supported her and Mary. Her defiance and her refusal to accept the annulment had also caused her husband problems with foreign policy, as Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, Catherine's nephew, had supported his aunt. So the king was delighted when news reached the English court that Catherine had died. Anne's thoughts are not recorded. Henry celebrated by parading to mass holding his daughter and accompanied by musicians. But the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who recorded this, makes no mention of Anne. I wonder if the news worried Anne in any way. After all, if Henry had decided their marriage was wrong, then he could end it and move on without anyone expecting him to go back to his first wife. And Anne was vulnerable until she gave birth to a son. She had enemies. Her marriage had been built on passion, perhaps even obsession, and that seemed to have waned somewhat. It wasn't surprising, really, given all the pressure that the couple had been under, and her husband was flirting with one of her ladies. I think Anne was under an incredible amount of pressure in early 1536. On the 24th of January 1536, Henry VIII was jousting at Greenwich when he suffered a jousting accident. Although one foreign source reported that he was without speaking for 2 hours, Reports written by those in England downplayed the accident. Although the accident could have been serious, for both king and horse fell heavily, the king was recorded as having sustained no injury. However, chronicler and Windsor Herald Charles Risley recorded that news of the accident frightened Anne, who was about 15 weeks pregnant, and caused her to go into premature labour and lose the baby, a male fetus. It must have been a devastating blow to the royal couple. Chapuis recorded Anne's miscarriage and the gossip that surrounded it. He wrote of how some put it down to her own incapacity to bear children, and that others blamed it on Anne fearing that the king would treat her like the late queen, especially considering the treatment shown to a lady of the court named Mistress Seymour, to whom, as many say, he has lately made great presents. While I don't believe that Anne's miscarriage caused her fall, I do believe it was a factor. I think the king's jousting accident was a reminder of his mortality. He could have been killed, and he didn't have a successor. He needed a legitimate male heir, and he needed one now. He wasn't getting any younger. Why wasn't God blessing his marriage to Anne? Well, there must be something wrong with it. Why was history repeating itself? I think it was at this point that the king began doubting his marriage. Perhaps it wasn't valid. And this coincided with his frustrations with Anne, who was very pro French, who was a strong character with her own views on foreign policy and religion, etc. He certainly didn't have a quiet life with Anne Boleyn. And I believe it was also at this time that the meek and mild Jane Seymour, who came from a large family with lots of sons, went from being a flirtation while his wife was pregnant to being a potential wife. There are so many factors in Anne Boleyn's fall, and I can't possibly go into them here. But it is safe to say that Anne would have been safe and secure as Queen Consort had that pregnancy gone to term and the little boy survived infancy. That child would have been her saviour. She would have been untouchable. Her enemies, like the Catholics at court, just couldn't have risen against her. I'm sure the king would have become bored of her and taken mistresses, but those women would not have affected Anne's status as Queen Consort. She would have given the king the greatest gift, a Prince of Wales, a future Tudor monarch. That was a Queen Consort's main duty, and she could have ticked that box. So the birth of a prince would have solidified her position as queen and saved her marriage. But what would have been the other potential outcomes? Well, Henry VIII would have felt more secure as king. While I don't believe that his behaviour suddenly changed in 1536 due to his accident or Anne Boleyn's fall, I do believe that knowing the succession was secure, well, more secure, would have affected his psyche, his outlook, his behaviour. Henry VIII felt he had to handle any challenges to his authority brutally because of his vulnerability, because he was a king without a male heir. So you never know, he might have become more reasonable when it came to the pilgrimage of grace, or perhaps not. He was a cruel and brutal man at heart, I feel. But men like Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, may well have survived his reign. After all, Surrey's execution and his father's downfall were caused by the paranoid king believing that Surrey was going to make a play for the throne. In 1547, Henry and Anne's son would have been 10, so not too far off his majority, and I'm sure Henry and Anne would have planned a regency council to help him rule. There would have been no reason for Henry VIII to become so paranoid about threats to the succession, and Anne may well have given the king a spare too by that time. A Prince of Wales would have given the Tudor dynasty stability and the country stability too. And what about Anne's survival? What impact would that have had? Well, she'd used her short time as queen to support reform. She'd been a patron of evangelical men and influenced their rise in both the church and at court. So her political and religious influence would have continued. Could she have further shaped the religious policies of the realm? That's hard to say. Henry was a Catholic at heart, But Anne had managed to influence him before by sharing evangelical texts with him. And if she'd stayed high in his favour by giving him a son, then I'm sure she would have continued having influence. Could the Reformation have started in earnest sooner? Perhaps so. And what about the dissolution of the monasteries? Anne had supported reform where it was needed, but had been opposed to the wealth of the monasteries going straight into the royal coffers. She wanted money to be spent on education and poor relief. So perhaps the dissolution of the monasteries wouldn't have been quite so devastating. Perhaps Anne's influence would have meant that the dissolution wouldn't have been quite so widespread, and that the social welfare lost by the closure of religious houses in some places would have been replaced with something else. It's so hard to know, though. After all, Anne was only Queen Consort. But the Queen Consort's role was to be a mediator between the king and his people. And I'm sure she would have shared her views and ideas on education and poor relief with the king and men like Cromwell. On the king's death, Anne wouldn't have been sidelined like Catherine Parr was. Catherine had expected to be made regent to help her young stepson Edward rule, but that didn't happen, and neither did the Regency Council appointed by Henry VIII. Edward Seymour took over as Lord Protector. But if Anne had survived Henry VIII's reign, then I'm sure as the new king's mother, she would have been regent or had some important role, probably with her brother George and with men like Archbishop Cranmer helping. The Seymours certainly wouldn't have risen in prominence, and the Boleyns would have carried on having influence at court. Perhaps the Church of England as we know it today would have been established properly in Anne's son's reign, with a religious settlement like that of Elizabeth I, and Protestantism would surely have carried on without any temporary return to Rome. Of course, had Anne survived, Henry wouldn't have married his other four wives, and Catherine Howard would have been safe. And Edward VI wouldn't have become king. He wouldn't have existed. We would never have had the succession crisis of 1553, and Mary and Elizabeth may never have become queens. If Henry and Anne's son had lived to the same age as his father at his death, 55, then he would have lived until 1591. Obviously, Elizabeth was still alive then, but her half-brother could well have had his own children, and the crown would have passed to them. If he died at the same age as his half-brother Henry Fitzroy, 17, then he would have died in 1553, 1554. So I guess there may still have been a succession crisis if he hadn't had a son by then. Mary probably would have laid claim to the throne still, but I suspect the late king's sister, Elizabeth, would have been his choice of successor, and she would have been legitimate as well, whereas Mary would still have been viewed as illegitimate. I'm not sure Mary's fight would have been successful if she'd been trying to remove Elizabeth. So we wouldn't have had the Protestant persecution of Mary's reign, but I suspect we may have had some Catholic persecutions instead. These were times of religious intolerance after all, brutal times. Oh, and if Anne had given birth to a healthy baby boy, then George Boleyn, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, and Mark Smeaton wouldn't have been executed either. And perhaps her parents would have lived longer with not suffering that awful grief. There are so many factors to consider, aren't there? And I'm sure I've missed some out, so please do comment and add your views. It's an interesting what if. And by the way, it's one that's been explored in fiction too, in books like the Boleyn trilogy by Laura Anderson, which comprises the Boleyn King, the Boleyn Deceit, and the Boleyn Reckoning. Please do comment. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Take care and see you soon.